Today we're going to be talking about some creatine and specifically its relevancy for cognitive performance. Creatine gets a lot of attention in the world of physical performance, and its use case is very well established over there. But today we're going to talk about, potential utility and lack thereof for gamers. So let's dive in to that. First off, who is this guy who is talking? My name is Casey Thomas. I am a performance dietitian by trade, which basically means I tell people what to eat in order to perform better, which is kind of fun. I like what I do. My background is in research, and we were investigating way back when all sorts of different pharmaceuticals and supplement compounds in both a clinical population and a healthy population. And our area of focus was specifically in neurological conditions or the brain in otherwise healthy folks. So we actually got to investigate a lot of this stuff, a lot of different compounds, and see how it impacted performance. After I did my stint in research, I started working in the traditional sports world. And my claim to fame there was how do we leverage different nutrition and supplement strategies to enhance different cognitive measures. And this is maybe surprising to people to hear, but in the traditional sports world, what you see is that most of the obvious stuff is banned. That makes you like bigger, faster, stronger, all that. But the stuff that enhances the brain, things like reaction time, hand-eye coordination, visual acuity, decision making in your team captains after bouts of fatigue, all this stuff gets a little bit of a gray area. So all these nootropic compounds, these nutritional strategies that we can leverage, basically get a free pass. And so I had a lot of success leveraging these strategies in the world of traditional sports, things like baseball, reaction time, hand-eye coordination right there, right? Shooting accuracy in basketball, team decision making in quarterbacks, all this. And so I got to work at the collegiate level. I got to work at the professional level. I've worked with many professional teams. I've worked with gold medaling Olympians. And for the last almost a decade, I've been working in esports because it was a nice little parallel jump to try to leverage some of those strategies in esports, which is largely in the cognitive realm. So yeah, that's me. I also have 2 kids and I love oatmeal. So fun facts, I suppose. Here's some of the pro teams and orgs that I've worked with in the past. There are more, and probably my favorite one that's not on here is EchoFox. That was what I did one of my very early research studies on, but they are unfortunately no more. So anyway, enough about me. I don't like talking about myself. It makes me uncomfortable. But I will move into talking about creatine. So to set the groundwork for this, I just want to lay a couple scary stats out there. The supplement industry is kind of spooky. When you look at the literature, what you'll see is something like 80% will actually fail. 80% of random products will fail a purity test, which kind of sucks. And depending on what literature you look at, just say it's terrifying. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. Depending on what literature you look at, also what you'll see is that there's anywhere from like 10 to 25% of random products off the shelf will actually make you test positive on a drug test. And not that everyone is getting drug tested regularly, but I don't know if you want, a bunch of illicit substances coursing through your veins without your consent, which is really bad. And coming from my background, in the world of sports, ultimately it's the responsibility of the athlete to determine what enters their system. So that kind of sucks. Some other scary stats, over like 50% of facilities fail their annual FDA audits, and it's cheaper for them to, just pay the fine, get the slap on the wrist than it is for them to actually button up their practices. So that's kind of the industry that we're walking into, which makes things really tricky. And one of the ways that we can protect ourselves is, there's essentially 2 ways. One way is to make sure that you're using a third-party verified product, and that's basically some third party who has no financial stake in your business assesses your product and checks to make sure that, yes, it passes a purity test. Yes, it doesn't have any illicit substances or like toxins in it. And yes, your facility is up to snuff. And so, a lot of times as a professional, I find myself recommending a lot of third-party verified products. However, the third-party verification process can be somewhat cost prohibitive for smaller companies. And this can be a problem because there are many smaller companies that are actually high quality. And so usually for me as a practitioner, if it's not third-party verified, then what I need to see is that I get sent those purity analysis reports directly, and I'll be able to, from there, essentially act as the third-party reviewer. And then from there, I can be a little bit more confident about recommending it, or I can be completely confident if I see the right data. And so anyway, just want to kind of lay that out there. If you are going to choose a product, you should choose one that is high quality. And then, so let's talk about creatine now. So, just to preface all this, as a dietitian, I'm very much a food first kind of guy. I think a lot of people try to out supplement, a bad diet or outwork a bad diet. And I think there's no real quick fix for a lot of things. So I'm very much so on the stance of you should have all your core fundamentals dialed in first. You should have, your nutrition dialed in. You should have your exercise dialed in. You should have your mental dialed in. Like you should have all the core pillars dialed in before you start reaching for supplements. Now, there are a couple supplements that are hard to get from diet, and creatine is one of those. So what you see is creatine, the average American, their creatine levels are floating at about 80% saturation. If you are elderly or vegan or vegetarian, then those numbers, your creatine stores tend to be closer to about 60% saturation. So what that means is the average diet is just not getting you the adequate creatine you need, and it's really, really hard to do so. Most people's diets are only giving 1 to 2 grams a day, and then our own bodies are making, another gram a day of its own creatine. So what this really means is if you really want to have your creatine gas tank filled up, you do need to supplement. So that's, beyond all the attention that creatine has these days. I just want to kind of put this out there that creatine is one of those supplements where you kind of have to get it from supplement form unless you plan on eating 3 whole chickens a day or something like that, which most people aren't going to do. So anyway, yes, diet and endogenous production account for several grams worth of creatine per day. And that might surprise some people because many people have only heard of creatine in its supplemental version. They don't realize that creatine is something that your body naturally makes by itself. And I think that's an important point because, it's not like some lab-grown compound that we just cooked up and are trying to force feed people. This is something your body has built into its natural systems and is something that your body is already creating several grams, or depending on what your genetics and a couple things. It's 1 to 2 grams per day. And then most people's diets also have some creatine in them. It's largely in animal-based foods and animal flesh, which is why the vegans and the vegetarians of the world will tend to have natural stores that are closer to that 60% saturation instead of, the 80% saturation. So just laying this out there, creatine is not some crazy compound. This is something that's already part of your body. Back in high school, my friend was warning me about it being an anabolic steroid. Yeah, there's so much misinformation about creatine, especially, depending on what age you're at. I remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of attention on creatine, and they thought it caused rhabdomyolysis, and that it was, basically like a steroid and is doing all this craziness. It's no, literally, if you're going to say creatine's bad for you, you got to also say that a salmon fillet is bad for you. It's it's really nothing. And again, it's cooked into your physiology already. So nothing spooky about creatine. So what does it do? Every single action that you take in life has to be paid for with some kind of energy. And that energy in the system, and this is as science heavy as I'm going to get, I promise, and then we'll move on to some more brass tack stuff. Actually, there's a little bit more science ahead. I lied. But yeah, we don't need to know it to, great depth. I just want to make sure that we understand, because it also sheds some light on, our protocols in future slides. So every single action you have to pay for with energy. It doesn't matter if you are, doing an exercise session, if you're just breathing, if you're listening and your brain is going, like if you're just thinking thoughts, you have to pay for those thoughts in the form of ATP. Okay, so everything is being paid for with ATP. And we have certain ways to regenerate ATP and to keep the energy flowing. We regenerate our ATPs with the foods that we eat. But the quickest method for resynthesizing that ATP is by using something called phosphocreatine. And you might hear in there the creatine word, right? But basically what happens is ATP is this molecule. It has these 3 phosphates on them. In order to use it for energy, we pop off a phosphate. It's kind of like a spring, and it just like gets released, and it releases a bunch of energy. And then what phosphocreatine does is it re-puts a phosphate back on that ATP, and you quickly resynthesize that ATP. It does a lot of other really cool things. You might see here this H+, which is a hydrogen ion, which is basically acid. Whenever you're doing exercise, you build up acid, and whenever you're doing even like physically stressful or cognitively demanding tasks, you also kick out a whole lot of acid. And so not only is creatine helping us remake energy, it's also buffering some of the acid, which is really cool if you ask me. Like it's double dipping. Lactic acid is a specific subtype of acid, which I have opinions about, and I can talk at length in my physio, kind of world. But basically, yes, acid leads to fatigue, and all sorts of activities carried out by the human lead to acid creation. Lactate and lactic acid is usually a byproduct of physical exertion. And if you have too much of it, you get fatigued. And so ATP or phosphocreatine, what it does is, 1, it makes energy back instantaneously, and 2, it buffers that acid. So it helps your body tolerate more acid before fatigue onsets. So it's double dipping as far as providing these like really cool benefits. In the world of physical activity, it's very well established. This is about as much as I'm going to say in the world of physical activity. But if people are curious about that after the fact, I can answer some questions about it. But we say, and this is not a light claim, creatine is the single most effective supplement for increasing high intensity physical exercise capacity. And because of that, as a consequence, it also helps increase lean tissue creation because you're able to train harder. There's all sorts of fun investigations into creatine for different clinical conditions and health conditions and other sorts of performance conditions and all this and that. But it does some very cool stuff for muscles. So I won't be talking about that unless people have questions afterwards. The rest of this is just going to be more about for the brain. I'll also add on this that this is the second most well-researched compound in existence, the first being caffeine. So second to caffeine, we have creatine, and creatine it's been crazy amount of research. I'm talking like tens and tens of thousands of research articles have been published, and something like over 70 to 80% like consistently show positive benefit. And most of the time in research world, we're lucky if we see like 55% of research articles show benefit. So creatine's kind of nuts in that standpoint, and any cursory review of the literature will show some very positive, promising impacts of it. Because it's the second most widely researched compound, we have a lot of data, and we figured most of it out. We figured out a whole lot about creatine. We know what it does. We know the absorption profile. We know how it's broken down. We know where it's going. We know all sorts of stuff about creatine. And one of the interesting things that I'll highlight here, which is something I kind of briefly touched on earlier, is you have this creatine gas tank. And most people are sitting at, 60 to 80% saturation. And what creatine does when you supplement with it is it just helps you top off that gas tank, your creatine tank. And so the interesting point here, which this graph is showing, is each one of these lines corresponds to an individual. And the bottom dots correspond to their baseline creatine, and the top dots correspond to after creatine supplementation, how much creatine they had. And what you see is that across all the participants, there's kind of like, it's like a triangle here, like it's kind of like a flat line on top. And this is because there's a ceiling with their creatine. And so the degree of improvements that you see with creatine are largely dictated by your starting creatine levels. So if your starting creatine levels are really low, like these people on the left, there's a lot of room for growth with your creatine. If your starting creatine levels are very high, like these people on the right, there's not quite as much growth, or not quite as much gas that you can put back into the gas tank. Most people are capped out with how much creatine they can have in their body, so there's a ceiling effect here. So it is true if, again, you are eating like a bunch of protein and you're following a carnivore style diet, eating like pounds and pounds of animal flesh per day, you might have higher than normal levels of creatine. There are also some genetic predispositions that make you have higher than normal creatine. But by and large, what I'm trying to point out here is like, if you haven't been supplementing with creatine, then most of the time you're going to relatively see, pretty big growth. But once you get to that ceiling, then there's no real growth that can happen beyond that. And you just kind of cruise. That's where we want to cruise. And, this kind of comes into our dosing protocols that we might talk about or we will talk about a little bit later. All right. So creatine for your brain. I'll just lay a couple things out there. I mean, when I was a kid, they told me that your brain was born with all the neurons you're ever going to have when you're born. And if you like bumped your head, then you're kind of screwed because you lost a couple neurons every time you bump your head. And then it's downhill from there. You can never replenish those. But your brain is actually growing, and there are areas across the lifespan that are undergoing what's called neurogenesis. And so you're making new neurons across the lifespan, and your brain is undergoing rather significant changes until, depending on the literature you look at, anywhere from like 25, 35, 40 years old, there are rather significant, profound changes in the brain that are occurring. And your brain, just like other tissues, has very unique nutritional requirements. The fun stat is, your brain's 2% of your body weight, and yet it consumes 20% of your total daily energy. That's pretty true. And the primary fuel that your neurons have access to is ATP phosphocreatine. Your neurons are kind of like these little divas, and they have all these support cells around the neurons. So in like muscle tissue, for example, your muscles will store all of the fuel that they need to do exercise. They'll store the ATP phosphocreatine, they'll store muscle glycogen, which is like stored carbs, and they'll even store, we have these little intramuscular triglycerides, or these like little fat droplets that are in your muscles too, that can provide fat as a fuel to burn for exercise. So you pretty much store everything, and then the muscle itself is stored protein, so you can break that down for fuel if you want to. So the body in other tissues stores all its fuel substrates, but neurons only have ATP phosphocreatine. And neurons is what like your brain is. That's like where all the hard work is done, is in your neurons. That's what carries out all the actions. And so in your brain, your neurons can only rely on ATP phosphocreatine. And then they have these support cells that have all these other, it's mostly glycogen and stored carbs. And when the neuron needs it, these support cells kind of like break it down and pass it on to the neuron for the neuron to use. In certain clinical conditions and like in sports and things like concussions, what happens is there's like a disrupted passing between the support cells and the neurons, and then they can't pass like the glycogen or the glucose to the neuron, and so the neuron starts to starve. But ATP phosphocreatine is inside there. So what this means is if you want to have the only way to directly enhance the energy storehouse of your neurons, The only way you can do that is by bolstering that ATP phosphocreatine store. So kind of interesting. This is basically the only method we have to improve our neurons directly in the brain because they don't have access to the other fuel substrates. Like we can't do like a carb load for the brain because the neurons don't store the carbs. But what we can do is we can creatine load the brain, which is kind of interesting. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but just want to highlight there on the physio side. Now, creatine has some problems from a feasibility standpoint. It does not dissolve well in water. Anyone who's taken creatine supplements before, you kind of know this. It just looks like a powder. It also has relatively poor bioavailability. So this means like what you eat is not necessarily going to be what your body can use. A lot of times it just passes through and gets excreted. It doesn't passively diffuse into cells or anything like that. We have to actively transport it. So if we want it, we have to force it in. And then most importantly, which I'll highlight here, is there is a transporter on the blood-brain barrier that uniquely transports creatine. And so the blood-brain barrier is like this big net or like, I guess door guard or something to your brain. And what the blood-brain barrier does is it makes sure that only what is explicitly permitted gets into the brain. Everything else is a no-go. And so it's like this really restrictive filter. And, it's like the most aggressive security guard you can get your hands on because we put a premium on our brain. If your brain doesn't work, the human dies. So we put this extra filter on the brain to make sure that only stuff we explicitly want in can get in. And there is a little creatine transporter, but one of the big problems is that creatine transporter is operating pretty much near saturation all the time. They've tested this out. A few days worth of creatine supplementation does not lead to any measurable increases in brain creatine levels, but it can lead to measurable increases in muscle creatine levels. It's much easier to get creatine into the muscles, much harder to get creatine into the brain. So that means we have to get sneaky to get creatine into the brain, which will lead to our dosing protocols that we'll talk about in a little bit. In order to increase brain levels, you have three main strategies. You have to go mega dose to like brute force your way in. So we're operating near saturation, but not at saturation. So you brute force it with a very high dose. You also need long durations to, progressively get more and more in there. Or you can trick the brain into letting more in than it should. And there's one main strategy that I'll talk about here with that, which is not something I recommend you employ, but it's something you can use as a just in case. All right, so let's start moving into some more things here. More brass tack stuff. We see that creatine is pretty instrumental to all sorts of brain and sleep conditions. Or creatine is instrumental in normal brain functioning and normal sleep functioning. And when we don't have appropriate creatine metabolism, you can develop certain clinical conditions, usually in the mental space, and you can also develop certain sleep issues as well. And so when we saw this in the clinical world, this led to some pretty easy solutions, right? So like if the scientists come out and say, oh, we know that low creatine leads to these sleep issues, then what happens if we supplement with creatine? Oh, the sleep issues go away. Great. Same thing with certain clinical mental conditions. They're like, oh, pour creatine here. We give them some creatine, and we can improve some of their symptoms. A lot of times, though, sleep and different mental disorders or neurodegenerative conditions, they do have a multifaceted physiological profile. So they might have disrupted like neurotransmitters or like other things going on that are beyond just creatine. But with the creatine supplementation in the clinical literature, what we do see is that supplementation can alleviate some of these symptoms. May not necessarily cure them, but can alleviate or improve the day-to-day of these individuals. Now, so that's interesting because it points to, hey, the brain is using creatine, and I told you it is. And it seems to be linked to some of these things that are relevant for performance, right? Sleep and just overall mental health. But then it gets more interesting, which is, okay, well, what happens in young, healthy individuals, people without clinical conditions? Is there still something that creatine can offer us? And the spoiler is yes, it absolutely can. But when you look at the literature, what you'll see is if you are young, if you are healthy, no clinical conditions whatsoever, if you are completely well rested and non-stressed, then most of the literature says creatine supplementation is doing nothing for the brain. So this is the big overarching picture. And, I am a creatine lover. So I just want to, put an asterisk here, which is we're going to talk about some situations where, it can be useful. But I just want to say that if you're doing everything absolutely right, then creatine doesn't seem to do a whole lot for the brain. Still does stuff for the muscles, which we're not talking about here, but doesn't seem to do a whole lot for the brain. Now, if your stores are disrupted or low for any reason, then we have a lot of data saying creatine absolutely helps. Creatine supplementation absolutely helps. And so the ones that I find almost every single person is encountering on a fairly regular basis is sleep deprivation and either mental or physical fatigue. So if you're working out hard, what we know is physical fatigue can lead to mental fatigue, and actually mental fatigue can lead to physical fatigue also. So those kind of go both ways. But if you are exercising, or if you're doing anything that's cognitively demanding, or if your sleep is not absolutely perfect, then your creatine is most likely not perfect either in your brain. And that's where I think the utility is strongest with creatine. So just a way to kind of think about it is all of these stressors. So like whether it's physical fatigue, mental fatigue, or sleep deprivation, or you can even think of some other physiological states, like if you travel when you're, just in a completely new environment, your circadian rhythm gets disrupted, or maybe you go to altitude and it's a little bit hypoxic, you're physically stressing the system as well. You're sick, you're physically stressing the system. There's a lot of different stressors that physiologically can hit us. And what ends up happening is you have an existing creatine pool in your brain, and it just drops your creatine pool. And we have a threshold for normal functioning. And if after your creatine pool drops, you go below that threshold, you're kind of SOL, and your performance starts to suffer. And also you become more at risk for, health and injury, or poor health and injury risk. And so what supplementation can do for us, which is helpful if you think that you will ever encounter these scenarios. No, I haven't gotten to the exact numbers, but I'll get there at the end. So while I said in normal healthy people that creatine doesn't seem to be doing very much, if you're someone who suspects that at any point in the near future you may encounter mental fatigue, or you may encounter physical fatigue, or you may encounter disrupted sleep, then creatine can be useful for you. Okay, and I think most people fall into that category where at some point in the future you may have those situations, right? And so what creatine does for you is it raises that level of your baseline creatine stores such that when those stressors come, you're not dipping below that threshold line that would impair your performance and make you more at risk for health and all that kind of stuff. So despite what I said with the literature review here, because most people encounter one of these situations, I do think that there is great utility in supplementing with creatine. All right, so I just want to talk about one particular study real quick. And this was probably my favorite study to come out in the last few years, honestly, because we have so much data around creatine in the physical performance measures. And this one answered a lot of questions for young, healthy people with an acute bolus dose of creatine. Can it do stuff for the brain? And it's talking about a sleep deprivation state, which I find most of us hit. At least I do. I'm guilty of sleep deprivation more often than not. And so what they did was they gave a single very large dose of creatine in a sleep deprived state, and they wanted to see what happened. And so just as a reminder, I kind of talked about this, like there's a couple ways that we can force creatine into the brain, right? We can either do a mega dose, or we can do a long duration, or we can trick it into absorbing a little bit more in some situations. And one of the ways to trick the brain into absorbing more creatine is to either mentally fatigue it, physically fatigue it, or get hit with some sleep deprivation. So this study, they sleep deprived people and they did a mega dose. And so what we're going to see here is that this actually led to more creatine getting to the brain, which is kind of cool. We know that you're literally dumber if you're sleep deprived. It takes just a little bit of disrupted sleep, and every single measure that you look at is significantly worse. For even minor amounts of sleep restriction, I think they did a cognitive battery on soldiers in one study, where it was like just an hour and a half sleep restricted. They compared like 6.5 hours of sleep a night to 8 hours a night. And on the cognitive battery, they basically scored, it was, I'm kind of averaging out some numbers here, but they scored around like 60% of what they should have. So instead of 100% of their baseline, they scored 40% less, like 60% of their baseline well-rested version then. This included things like reaction time, memory, focus ability, like decision making, all that kind of stuff. So sleep deprivation makes you dumb. And so what these authors or what these researchers want to do is let's do a mega dose, let's see what happens, and let's assess their cognitive capacity across the evening after they do this mega dose of creatine. And the dose they used here was 0.35 gram per kg. This is kind of high. If you're on the bigger side, this might be like close to 25, 30 grams of creatine. If you're on the smaller side, maybe it's like around 20 grams creatine, 15, 20 grams, something like that. But you can calculate it out for yourself if you want to. This number is a little bit high. This number is a little bit high compared to some other literature, and it's not actually what I would usually recommend. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But this is what they did in this study. They did a true kind of, you feel like you're a druggie a little bit. 0.35 gram per kg creatine is kind of high. And so here's what happened. And I want to highlight here. So they did a big cognitive battery. All the red bars are the creatine. All the gray bars are placebo. If it's going down, it means performance got worse. And if it's going up, it means performance got better. So what we saw here was if you compare creatine to placebo, creatine's always better. It doesn't matter which one you look at. Like creatine's always better. And there's something that's really interesting, though, is some of these, creatine is improved above baseline. And I want to just contrast this real fast with the other very well popular compound that's out there for people who are sleep deprived, which is caffeine. So a lot of people use caffeine as a crux for poor sleep, right? And when we're talking about caffeine, what we say is that caffeine is able to partially restore lost performance, but not completely restore lost performance. So in those soldiers that I talked about who went down to like 60% of their baseline performance, when they took caffeine, they go up to maybe 80% of their baseline performance. So you get partial restoration of lost performance, but not complete restoration of lost performance. And so, with this study, what I'm trying to say here is, see some of these red bars are above zero. This means not only did you completely preserve performance, you actually got faster and like, better because of this situation. Like this single dose of creatine puts your baseline performance above baseline performance, which is nuts because caffeine, which is what everyone uses right now for sleep deprivation, can only partially restore lost performance. So you're still net like minus 20% performance with caffeine, but here we saw like plus 20% performance with creatine in the single dose. So this is absolutely mind-blowing. So this was speed on the right. These were just like raw cognitive metrics on the left, but this was where creatine really shined, was in essentially like mental processing speed and reaction time. So you're literally thinking clearer and faster in response to this mega dose of creatine with sleep deprivation, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I cannot like underline that enough, that this is mind-blowing, because creatine, it's like completely blowing caffeine out of the water here. And then this other stuff is maybe a little bit too technical. We don't have to talk about this too much, but basically what we did see is sleep deprivation does lead to more acid in the brain. Okay, we talked about acid, and creatine buffered it. So creatine led to there being less acid in the brain. So physical stressors, mental stressors, sleep deprivation, all this leads to more acid buildup in the brain, which is not good, leads to fatigue. And consistent with its mechanism, we also saw that creatine preserved and reduced the acid load in the brain. So kind of cool. Okay. So all that to be said is, all right, here's probably what most people care about. What are we going to actually use our creatine? What are we going to use our creatine? When are we going to use it? How much are we going to take? All this kind of stuff. If we're going with mechanism one, which is big doses and long durations, then what most of the literature says is you need a dose of around 0.3 gram per kg for closer to about a week, and that will lead to measurable increases in brain creatine levels. This, if anyone is familiar with creatine in the physical world, is kind of what we did in that space during the loading phase. So a lot of people in the physical space may do like a creatine load to get their levels up really quick, and then they'll go to a cruise dose. We're basically talking about doing the load similarly here to get your brain levels up pretty quickly. After that, then what you can do is you can drop your levels down to a cruise dose similarly, around like 5 grams per day. But because your brain is going to eat through that a lot faster, you're going to have to keep doing these creatine loads. And the way that I would usually do it is like once a month or so. Or you keep your cruise dose much higher, closer to like 10 grams a day. So you have two options. Benefits seem to be limited to periods of acute stress. Okay, so physical, mental, or sleep deprivation are probably the most common ones. But you still want to have a topped off creatine gas tank on the front end, because it's going to take like a week for those levels to build up. So if you just have a situation where it's just a one-off, it's really tough to get your brain levels up really high in a short duration. So it's better to preemptively have the creatine levels topped off and just kind of be ready to go just in case. But the really cool thing is we can even still, if you are acutely stressed, use creatine to rescue performance. And I think that's the big takeaway from that study that I just went over, is it offers another tool in the toolbox for people who are sleep deprived. Many of the gamers and esports athletes that I work with, what ends up happening is some of them can't use caffeine. Some of them get like anxious and jittery when they're taking caffeine. And so they're like, well, what do I do? I'm sleep deprived, I'm screwed, and I can't use caffeine like everybody else. This is another tool that you can use. You can do a mega dose of the creatine to try to rescue that performance. So typically what I'm usually doing is saying, make your brain have a robust creatine store. And then in addition to that, if you ever do have acute periods of stress, then we can layer in the bolus doses also there too. And yeah, I'll shut up there, but if anyone wants like more specific numbers, let me know. But there's the creatine dosing protocol. At what rate do you lose the topped off creatine amount back to the typical creatine level without supplementation? Usually takes about 2 to 4 weeks for your levels to start to dip. So on this like final little, contact slide, I will just say I'm notoriously awful at social media, but I love talking about this. So anyone, if you have questions, I'll answer them here now. And if anyone wants me to help them out with any kind of nutrition or supplement strategies, just feel free to shoot me a DM. But yeah, so it takes about 2 to 4 weeks for your levels to dip, which is why if you're doing the mega, the loading phase once a month, and then you go to a cruise dose, that'll hold you over until next month before you do another load. And so you can just kind of keep it going that way. Yeah, some people do report GI issues with creatine. This is one of two things can be happening here. One, the creatine is loaded up with a lot of artificial like flavors and fillers and stuff that people tend to be more sensitive to. In which case you just need like a straight creatine monohydrate, something like that. Alternatively, if you're running into issues from the creatine, then it's usually just drink more water. Creatine by itself has an amazing safety profile and should not cause any GI upset in people unless you're doing, maybe this like stupid bolus dose, like 35 grams, and you're just dry scooping it into your mouth. If you're like that, then drink more water. Usually in the loading phases, I tell people to drink an extra glass of water per day just to account for it. And you can also take it with food, which helps lessen the burden a little bit as well on the GI system. But most of the time, it's just because they're taking a whole bunch of powder and they didn't drink enough fluids, or they were already dehydrated when they started doing it. The other thing you can do is you can space out your doses in a day. So let's say you need 25 grams a day for the loading phase. Do 5 grams every so often, and that'll help out with protection there. Day 2 of a 25 gram loading phase, I did the calcs. I might do the bolus for 35 and dry scoop in it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, you probably should drink a little bit more water still, but when it's just me, I do dry scoop. Creatine is flavorless, so it's like that's one of those ones where you can actually just dry scoop it, and then I'll wash it down with a bunch of water. But because it doesn't absorb well into the water, I find that's it's easier to make sure I get all in my mouth first. But yeah, so if you did the calculations and you have and you're sitting at a 35 gram, I would space it out a little bit still. If you're going to do it for a week, I would do it like 10 10 5 or 10 10 10 5 or something like that, or 15 10 10. But I would still space it out. It'll speed it up a little bit, make it a little bit easier on the stomach, and then you can do that for like 5 to 7 days and your levels should be topped off. Does dosing time and dose with meal not matter? So from a gut perspective, taking it with food can help out. If you are really trying to be on point in the early loading phase, then you can do it around a workout, because the workout itself will kind of stress the system in a way that you absorb a little bit more. If you have a mental or sleep deprivation state, you can also take it more around that sleep deprivation. So like front loaded early in the morning after you were, like let's say last night you slept 4 hours, then taking most of it right now, your brain is right now really suffering. And so it wants to absorb more creatine. So you can put things around those stressful situations in a way that will enhance absorption. But once your levels are topped off, so like after week 1, after you've done the loading phase, dosing time no longer matters. Unless you have that sensitive stomach, in which case you take it with food. So timing really only matters in the first week if you're just trying to super accelerate your levels from topping off. But once your levels are topped off, doesn't matter what time of day you take it. Let's see. So much more convenient. Yeah, honestly, and you can guarantee that you get all of it. So I definitely dry scoop all the time. It does not taste bad. It doesn't taste like it. Okay, the worst tasting supplement that I've ever tasted is if you get an unflavored BCA. That stuff is foul. Like that stuff is awful. Creatine though, nah, creatine's fine. Like creatine's easy. Here, let me close this real fast. Let me stop sharing so I can come over here. Okay, I'm here, guys. Uh, no, so because creatine has poor solubility, and basically what will happen is if you put creatine in a cup of water and you try to mix it, then usually there's a little bit of residue at the bottom. And so it's like I didn't really get all of it. So what I do is I just put all of the creatine into my mouth and then like I wash it back with some water. Most people don't like to do that. The thought of it's weird, but I mean, I'm kind of a weirdo. Like I'm fine with also like dry scooping protein powders and stuff into my mouth. Most people are like, nah, I need to mix it, but I'm a little bit wonky, so don't listen to me. Never had a good experience dry scooping anything. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart, you know. I fully respect people who do not dry scoop. In fact, I never tell any of my clients to dry scoop. It's just when you're doing a mega dose of creatine and I'm trying to get it all in and I know it's not going to dissolve and I want to make sure I get all of it, I just do it that way. It makes it easier. But I don't blame anyone. Have there been any negative effects of creatine recorded? Yeah, so the most consistently reported side effect in the literature is weight gain. And then the second one is potential GI upset. So the weight gain is something that people take creatine explicitly for, though, because people like to build muscle. So so you're pulling water into your muscles. And that's kind of what a lot of people want. A lot of people take creatine for that explicit purpose, but in the literature, it gets reported as a side effect because not everyone wants weight gain. So there are many athletes, for example, that I work with in the traditional sports space who don't want to weigh more. They want the benefits of creatine, but they don't want to weigh more. You can think about a track athlete where every single pound of weight that they have to carry is a detriment because they have to carry that pound of weight around the track a million times. So what a lot of times we'll do with like those kind of individuals is we'll actually do off season, we'll train with creatine on, and then we'll wash off of the creatine or we'll go very low dose creatine. So that way we can get rid of some of that water weight that the creatine has added. Is it really weight gain or is it just better hydrated? On a scan, it will flag as extra lean tissue. And you are being better hydrated though. So it kind of depends on what you would define as, is it really weight gain? I mean, yes, it shows on the scale, right? Did you gain meaningful tissue? That's a little bit more of a dicey question because no, I didn't make new muscle fibers, but yes, I did have more volume and weight inside my muscles. So on a scan, it's going to look like your muscles are bigger, which is true. But you're like 70%, depending on your body fat percentage, you're like 60% water right now. Do you consider that water to be part of you? I mean, 60% of your body weight right now is water. So it just kind of depends on how you would define that. What you do see is for the physical world, because you're able to train harder, you will build more muscle over time though. Like you'll build more actual of the muscle fiber, not just the water that goes with it. So if you compare someone who trains with creatine across a year to someone who doesn't train with creatine across a year, and then the person with the creatine, you wash off the creatine at the end so you can remove all that extra water that's in there. The person who trained with the creatine will have built more muscle across the year because they were able to train harder and improve their exercise performance and all this kind of stuff with the recovery capacity, made them more resilient to injury because they were better hydrated and all this and that. So, so creatine does lead to muscle gain. It does lead to weight gain in the short term. And depending on if you want that or not, that could be considered a side effect. And then the stomach issues, again, that's probably the second most reported side effect. Everything beyond that is a lie. Okay. I should also say there are certain clinical conditions where maybe creatine isn't indicated. I'm thinking about things like chronic kidney disease and so on, where you need to be like on dialysis. Those people have a unique situation where their body doesn't know how to process certain foods, of which creatine is kind of tough for them. So we are a little bit mindful. But in normal, healthy people, If you are working out, I think you don't care if your muscles get a little bigger. And then if you're drinking more fluid, then you're also okay. The bloat is usually because of something GI related and not necessarily like a genuine side effect.